The morning Caleb Rowe decided to speak his need aloud, the prairie was holding its breath, dust lifting like a prayer that had forgotten its words. His ranch lay thin and tired under the pale Wyoming sun, fences bowed with age, boards whispering of storms they had outlived but never healed from. He moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned to ration strength, every step weighed against the ache he refused to name. When he saw her standing at the edge of his land, still as a thought, wrapped in faded cloth, eyes dark with listening, something in him tightened as if the day had been waiting for that exact shape to appear, and he wondered what kind of trouble arrived without sound. He did not greet her the way men greeted strangers in those days, with questions sharpened like knives. Instead, the words slipped from him plain and unguarded, as if honesty were the only currency he had left. "I need a helper, and you look like you need shelter." He hated himself for how small the offer sounded against the sky, yet he could not dress it up without lying. Ayanna Gray Elk studied him then, not his land, not the house sagging behind him, but his hands, scarred, trembling just enough to tell the truth he would not speak. She had been turned away since dawn, from doors that smiled before closing, from kindness that recoiled at the sight of her, and still she did not answer at once, as though weighing whether survival was worth the price of another man's disappointment. The town of Red Willow had already decided who Caleb Rowe was long before that morning, and it was not a man worth helping. He was the quiet one who failed at conversation, the rancher whose herd thinned each winter, the figure who lingered at the edge of gatherings like a fence post everyone leaned on but never repaired. Sheriff Amos Caldwell watched him with the patience of someone waiting for rot to show, and Mrs. Lottie Finch at the boarding house spoke his name the way one spoke of weather, unfortunate, unavoidable. Ayanna had felt that same gaze on her since her family scattered like birds before a fire, and she recognized the familiar shape of judgment settling in her chest, asking how much she could carry without breaking. She accepted the bargain with a nod that was neither grateful nor afraid, and Caleb felt the land shift under his boots, as if the earth itself had marked the moment. They walked together toward the ranch house without touching, a careful distance between them that said this was survival, not mercy. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and colder nights, of meals eaten alone and conversations swallowed before birth. Caleb offered her a place to sleep and work to do, nothing more, yet he found himself listening harder than he ever had, curious about the way she moved as if the world were speaking softly just for her. Days unspooled with a quiet that was not empty but watchful. Ayanna learned the rhythm of the ranch without instruction, her hands steady on reins, her presence calming the horses Caleb could no longer outmuscle. He noticed how she paused before dusk each evening, eyes lifting to the horizon as if counting something only she could see, and wondered what memories required such careful tending. They spoke little, but meaning gathered in the spaces between them, in the way she set aside the best portion of food for him without comment, in the way he repaired a door latched twice to be sure it would not fail her in the night. The town rode past more often now, glances lingering, whispers growing bolder, and Caleb felt the familiar weight of shame settle deeper, asking how long borrowed peace was allowed to last. The storm came hard one afternoon, sky cracking open without warning, rain driving sideways like accusation. They were caught in the barn when the first thunder struck, the horses screaming their fear into the dark. Caleb's leg gave out beneath him as it sometimes did, pain flashing white-hot, pride shattering faster than bone. Before he could apologize, Ayanna was there, grounding him with calm hands and a voice low enough to be mistaken for the wind. In the hush between thunderclaps, she spoke a fragment of her past, not the violence itself, but the leaving, the way land can be torn from you without ever moving. Caleb listened as if confession were a form of shelter, wondering how two lives so differently wounded could recognize each other so easily. When the storm passed, it left more than broken branches in its wake. Sheriff Caldwell arrived the next morning with questions dressed as concern, his eyes flicking toward Ayanna with a hunger that pretended to be law. He warned Caleb about appearances, about peace, about how easily trouble found men already on the edge. Caleb nodded as he always had, the habit of yielding rising up before courage could speak, but something in Ayanna's stillness cut through him sharper than any threat. That night, he saw her quietly packing her bundle again, movements practiced, resignation heavy as dusk, and he understood how close he was to becoming just another door that closed. The choice that followed did not come from words but from the slow, deliberate act of standing where he had always stepped aside. When Ayanna walked toward town at dawn, Caleb followed, not to lead, not to protect, but to be seen beside her. She spoke to Red Willow with a steadiness that left no room for interruption, claiming no innocence, asking no forgiveness, only naming her right to exist without apology. The silence that answered her was not kind, but it was changed, and in that narrow space, Caleb felt something like dignity take root, fragile and alive. They returned to the ranch as the sun lowered, the land unchanged yet somehow listening closer. Supper was simple, the work waiting for morning, and nothing was promised aloud, yet the air between them held the warmth of something earned rather than given. As the fire burned down and shadows stretched long across the floor, Caleb wondered whether shelter could become home without anyone daring to say it, and whether the next dawn would demand a courage he was only just learning how to keep. Morning arrived like a decision that could not be undone, neither gentle nor cruel, just clear. Caleb noticed that Ayanna was already awake, standing at the edge of the yard, her fingers brushing the soil as if reminding it, and herself, that both were still here. Silence after a hard night carried a different weight, as though the world was reconsidering its shape, and Caleb felt that if he chose the wrong words now, everything they had held together might quietly fall apart. He said nothing, only slid a cup of water toward her, and in that small motion lived a promise heavier than speech, leaving behind the quiet question of whether such small kindnesses could ever be enough. Red Willow woke with its usual habits intact, though something in the air had sharpened. Eyes lingered longer than politeness allowed, following Ayanna as though her presence unsettled something the town preferred not to examine. Sheriff Amos Caldwell passed the ranch more often than necessary, his horse's hooves striking the earth with deliberate certainty, and each time Caleb felt that familiar bell of fear and weariness ring in his chest. Ayanna noticed it all and still moved without haste, each step a calm refusal to surrender space. Caleb wondered how easily people mistook silence for weakness, and how often true strength learned to speak only through restraint. One evening, when the sky burned red and the scent of dry grass clung to the wind, Elias Boone arrived without announcement. He set down a bundle of firewood, left an old hammer near the fence and said nothing at all, yet his presence carried a message clearer than words, that not everyone chose cruelty when given the chance. Ayanna watched him leave, and for the first time Caleb saw softness pass across her face like a shadow of relief. He understood then that connection was not always built through conversation. Sometimes it formed simply because someone stopped and did not turn away, even as doubt lingered about whether such quiet decency could withstand the town's louder judgments. Tension gathered slowly like water beneath frozen ground, until the day it finally broke through. Sheriff Caldwell came with 2 men, their talk wrapped in the language of law but heavy with intent. Ayanna had no papers to justify her place, and Caleb found himself standing in the narrow space between habit and resolve, weighed down by old promises he had made only to himself and broken year after year. As their eyes fixed on him, life seemed to ask its question again, whether he would become the man who yielded out of fear, or one who stood even while trembling. He looked down at the dirt for a long moment, then raised his head, and that simple act carried the weight of a lifetime. Before Ayanna stepped forward, she looked at him, not to ask permission and not to offer comfort, but as if acknowledging a shared ground neither of them had known before. She spoke in the center of town with a steadiness that left no room for interruption, her voice quiet yet deep enough to force others into listening. She did not display her pain, only named her presence, and that was enough to alter the air itself. Caleb stood beside her with all his uncertainty exposed, and for the first time he understood that dignity was not something granted by others. It was something practiced, again and again, despite fear. Nothing changed overnight, yet something essential stopped breaking. People still watched, but their gazes had softened, stripped of the careless cruelty they once carried. Life at the ranch resumed its familiar rhythm: morning chores, evening meals, the occasional smile that arrived without explanation. Ayanna's hands sank deeper into the soil now, planting more than crops, and Caleb felt himself changing too, speaking little as always, but no longer retreating when it mattered. Months passed and what was never spoken found its way into ritual. One quiet day, without spectacle or celebration, Elias and 2 others stood as witnesses while Caleb and Ayanna remained side by side, not out of victory nor fear, but because life had taught them how to stay. Marriage brought no noise to their world, only a deeper calm, like rain finally accepted by the earth. If you ever find yourself standing at a place where the world expects you to bow, remember that shelter is not always built from walls. Sometimes it is simply the courage to remain where you are, and to let someone else remain as well. This is a story about the moment 2 people chose not to run, and in that stillness discovered a life large enough to hold them both.